Before Assyria had palaces, the Tigris crossed a northern plain of wind, reeds, and dust. This land was called Ashur, and from that hard frontier, a vast empire would rise. Stay with us. In 15 minutes, you'll see how Assyria rose, ruled by terror, and fell. Around 1900 BCE, Ashur already stood on caravan routes linking Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Its merchants traded tin and textiles for silver, building wealth before building empire. Clay tablets from that world, record debts, marriages, shipments, and disciplined commerce. Assyria began not as a monster, but as a trading city learning the cost of exposure. Trade made Ashur useful, but usefulness invited stronger neighbors and harder ambitions. Kings learned that roads, contracts, and silver lasted only when soldiers guarded them. So commerce slowly gave way to militarized rule on the northern Mesopotamian edge. In the 18th century BCE, Shamshi-Adad I seized Ashur and forged a larger kingdom. He tied northern Mesopotamia together and made Ashur the center of broader power. For a brief moment, Assyria looked less like a market town and more like a state. But early kingdoms were brittle, and this one weakened soon after its founder died. Rivals closed in, alliances shifted, and Assyria sank beneath stronger regional powers. For much of the second millennium BCE, it lived under Babylonia and then Mitanni. The name endured, but independence did not. Assyria waited, endured, and learned. That return began in the 14th century BCE, when Assyria broke free once again. Ashur-uballit, I turned recovery into ambition and pushed the kingdom outward again. Assyria was no longer content to survive. It wanted rank, territory, and obedience. Adad-nirari, I struck down Mitanni's remains and expanded deeper into contested lands. Shalmaneser, I pressed the advantage and strengthened Assyrian power across the north. Campaign after campaign, a harsher pattern emerged. Conquer, deport, resettle, absorb. The state learned that fear could move populations faster than loyalty ever could. That lesson would become one of Assyria's most enduring and darkest strengths. Then to Ninurta, I struck Babylon itself and carried off immense prestige. For an Assyrian king, that victory proved even ancient powers could be humiliated. Yet expansion brought strain, and after his death, Assyrian fortunes declined again. The old rhythm returned: revival, overreach, danger, retreat, then another recovery. That cycle would define Assyria for centuries before its final imperial explosion. In the 11th century BCE, Tiglath-pileser I restored confidence through war. He campaigned widely, reached the Mediterranean, and advertised royal power in stone. Assyria could still shock the region, but it could not hold that intensity forever. After 1100 BCE, Aramaean pressures and regional disorder cut at Assyria's borders. The kingdom shrank, but it did not disappear. It endured like a blade under sand. Then came the great revival historians call the Neo-Assyrian Empire. In 912 BCE, Adad-nirari II began reconquering lost lands and securing the core. His reign marks the opening of Assyria's final and most formidable imperial age. Successors inherited more than territory. They inherited a system built for expansion. Tukulti-Ninurta II pushed north and south, testing how far recovery could now go. Then Ashurnasirpal II turned recovery into open intimidation on an imperial scale. He campaigned through the Levant, subdued cities, and made terror part of policy. Siege, massacre, deportation, display. Assyria fused cruelty with statecraft. Enemy resistance was answered with examples designed to travel farther than armies. Obedience spread because the stories of disobedience were made unforgettable. Ashurnasirpal II also moved the capital from Ashur to Kalhu, later called Nimrud. There he built palaces, reliefs, and gardens with wealth stripped from campaigns. The empire looked magnificent because so many conquered peoples were forced to pay. Beauty and brutality were already becoming two faces of the same imperial system. Under Shalmaneser III, Assyrian power surged west toward Syria and the coast. Tribute flowed from Levantine rulers, and Israel appears within Assyrian records. The machine kept moving, but giant empires always carry weakness inside success. After Shalmaneser, civil war under Shamshi-Adad V split the empire within. Expansion stalled, and rivals watched for the moment Assyria might finally crack. Yet the state recovered again, proof its institutions were growing harder to break. Adad-nirari III stabilized the realm, though later kings let momentum decay. Armies softened, the court drifted, and enemies sensed fresh room to challenge. Then one ruler changed everything by making empire more systematic than heroic. Tiglath-pileser III took power in 745 BCE and rebuilt army and administration. He replaced looser control with provinces, levies, oversight, and tighter extraction. Conquest became bureaucratic. Expansion no longer depended on one king's charisma. Provinces supplied men and grain, while tribute and taxes kept the center armed. This was empire as machinery, cold, organized, efficient, and built to keep moving. He reconquered the West and restored Assyrian dominance over Babylon as well. Assyria now dominated much of the Near East with unprecedented reach and control. Its army was feared for mobility, siegecraft, discipline, and extensive iron weaponry. Cities faced sappers under walls, ramps at gates, and engines pounding defenses. What resisted was crushed. What submitted was taxed, moved, counted, and reused. After him, Shalmaneser V continued the pressure, though his reign was short. Then Sargon II took the throne and drove Assyrian power even farther. He enlarged the borders, tightened administration, and filled the royal treasury. Under him, Assyria did not merely win battles, it organized victory itself. He also founded Dur-Sharrukin, a capital built to stage imperial certainty in stone. Palaces, courtyards, winged bulls, and reliefs projected order, scale, and dominance. But certainty carved in stone can vanish faster than kings are willing to believe. Sargon died on campaign, and the throne passed to his son Sennacherib. Sennacherib campaigned relentlessly in Anatolia, the Levant, and Babylonia. He also transformed Nineveh into one of the grandest cities in the ancient world. His palace was called the Palace Without Rival, and the name was deliberate. Reliefs filled room after room with war, labor, tribute, and choreographed triumph. Aqueducts, canals, orchards, and engineered landscapes made Nineveh glitter with power. But Babylon kept rebelling, and Sennacherib answered with catastrophic fury. In 689 BCE, he sacked Babylon and devastated one of the oldest great cities. The act displayed Assyrian strength, but it also advertised dangerous sacrilege. Even for empire, some victories poison the ruler who wins them. Sennacherib was later murdered, and succession again opened amid blood and crisis. Esarhaddon emerged victorious and moved to rebuild what his father had ruined. He restored Babylon, secured the throne, and pushed Assyrian power farther south. In 671 BCE, his armies conquered Egypt and reached a scale few states had imagined. From the Zagros to the Nile, Assyria stood as the region's dominant power. Esarhaddon also used treaties to bind Medes and Persians to his chosen heir. Even at its peak, the empire knew succession could destroy what armies had built. That heir was Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria. He was a conqueror, but also a collector who filled Nineveh with written knowledge. His library gathered myths, omens, records, letters, epics, and learned traditions. Because of that archive, much of Mesopotamia survived the empire that ruled it. Yet Ashurbanipal was no gentler than the kings who came before him. He crushed Elam, intervened again in Egypt, and punished revolt with spectacle. Assyrian art from his reign shows banquets beside severed heads in gardens. The message was plain. The king could enjoy beauty and brutality at once. At its height, Assyria was the largest empire the world had yet seen. It stretched across Mesopotamia, the Levant, parts of Anatolia, Egypt, and beyond. Roads, provinces, garrisons, governors, tribute, and archives held that mass together. But conquest on that scale created costs no victory could permanently erase. Frontiers grew longer, garrisons thinner, and subject peoples more exhausted and bitter. The empire's strength depended on campaigning again and again to defend old gains. Fear kept provinces obedient, but fear is costly, and loyalty is always cheaper. Assyria had mastered shock, not affection, and that difference would matter later. When Ashurbanipal died in 627 BCE, the great machine began to fail. His successors could not hold the empire's scale, prestige, or internal discipline. Ashur-etil-ilani ruled briefly, and conflict soon opened the road to collapse. Sinshar-ishkun struggled to contain revolt as old enemies sensed opportunity. In the south, Babylon rose again under leaders who rejected Assyria's shadow. In the east, the Medes advanced and added weight to the empire's unraveling. The danger was not one invasion alone. It was coalition meeting exhaustion. Assyria had spent centuries teaching rivals how badly they needed it gone. In 614 BCE, the old city of Ashur fell to the Medes. 2 years later, the storm reached Nineveh, the imperial heart. Babylonians and Medes attacked together, and the greatest city of the age was doomed. In 612 BCE, Nineveh was sacked, burned, and broken open after bitter fighting. Its palaces collapsed, its walls failed, and royal certainty vanished in smoke. King Sinshar-ishkun died in the catastrophe as the center of empire imploded. It looked like total oblivion, but Assyria did not die in a single day. A remnant state rallied around Ashur-banipal II and fled west to Harran. There, among retreat and ruin, the empire tried to pretend it still existed. Egypt even supported the remnant, hoping to block Babylonian expansion northward. But the old aura was gone, and without it, Assyria was just another broken power. In 610 BCE, Harran fell, and the remnant lost its last capital. By 609 BCE, final defeat ended the Assyrian Empire as a state. The lands once ruled from Nineveh passed into Babylonian control. The empire that had terrorized the Near East vanished with astonishing speed. So why does Assyria still loom so large in history? Because it shaped empire itself. Central rule, mass deportation, siege mastery, scale. It showed how administration and warfare could fuse into a single imperial machine. It also showed the limit of power built mainly on fear. Terror can force obedience, but it cannot erase resentment, fatigue, or ambition. Assyria kept winning until the cost of winning became impossible to carry. Its fall was sudden only at the end. Its causes were slow and cumulative. Overreach, succession crises, revolt, and overburdened frontiers had grown for years. When the final coalition struck, it hit a power already cracked from within. Even then, Assyria's enemies failed to erase everything it had been. The fires that destroyed Nineveh also baked clay tablets hard enough to survive. Those buried texts carried myths, records, and the memory of Mesopotamia forward. In trying to erase Assyria from history, its destroyers preserved part of history. That irony suits the empire itself. Immense, brutal, brilliant, and impossible to forget. Assyria rose from trade, mastered war, and built the first true superpower. It expanded through discipline, terror, bureaucracy, and relentless military pressure. It fell because no empire can stretch forever without breaking something vital. This was Assyria, magnificent, ruthless, inventive, and never truly secure. 3,000 years ended in fire, ash, buried walls, and a silence full of echoes. This was 3,000 years of Assyria in 15 minutes, from military terror to oblivion.